All right. So there's a few things that I wanted to talk about today. The main thing is the relationship between the employer and the employee, or the capitalist and the wage earner, if you want to think of it that way. Also, want to talk a little bit about subjective value, the subjective theory of value, and profit, and where profit actually comes from, and the role that profit actually has in an economy. So the reason for touching on these different ideas is I think they really help show how the common anti-capitalist argument that it's nothing but exploitation is fundamentally mistaken. Now, in order to do that, I should first probably explain that a little bit more in detail. What exactly that objection is? It's basically it's based on the labor theory of value, and it's the idea that the value of a good is determined by its embodied labor, so to speak. Another way of thinking of it is the social necessary labor. So it's not just how long it takes for one person to produce something, but it's kind of the average for the society to produce that good. And so that means that if the value of a good is determined based on the labor that's put into it, if all things were right and fair in the world, this objection would say that the worker would be entitled to the full value of his labor. And so if he's working for 8 hours a day, he should be entitled to the full 8 hours worth of the product. But that's not what happens. Instead, in order to survive, he only really needs to work 4 hours. And so he goes to work, and instead of going home in 4 hours, his boss keeps him there for an extra 4 hours to produce a surplus of goods that the boss then takes for themselves to then sell for a profit and keep all of this money. And so this relationship where the worker comes in, works for some time to meet his basic needs, and then works extra time to produce surplus that is then essentially taken from him by the capitalist, is one that is considered to be of exploitation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is really based on the labor theory of value. Problem is that the labor theory of value has basically been long abandoned by economists of pretty much all stripes. It was abandoned during what was known as the marginalist revolution. And this was a revolution that took place in Europe amongst three different people in three different countries who all kind of came to this idea simultaneously. And those three people were Karl Menger, who's the founder of the Austrian school, William Stanley Jevons, and Leon Walras. The marginalist revolution was the idea that a good's value is not determined by the labor that's put into it, but it's actually determined by the subjective marginal utility that it gives an individual, which basically means that the value of a good comes from the lowest satisfaction, the lowest unmet satisfaction that it could that it could meet. So basically, this means that as you get more of something and it meets more and more of your satisfactions, you then start valuing it less and less and less and less because it's now meeting lower and lower valued satisfactions. An example of this would be Robinson Crusoe on an island. Let's say he's got 4 different bags of wheat, A, B, C, and D. Bag A is he's going to use for eating to stay alive. Bag B he's going to use to grow more wheat. Bag C he's going to use to make beer, and then bag D he's going to use for feeding a pet. So this is the ranking of each of the different goods that he has based on his own subjective preferences. And someone else, if it was not Robinson Crusoe, if it was someone else on there, they might rank them differently. They'd probably still have eating to stay alive first, but maybe they want a pet more than they want beer, so they might switch D and C. Anyway, if one of the bags ended up getting eaten, like bag A got eaten by another animal, Crusoe would not then abstain from eating and die and just continue to make beer and feed his pets and grow more wheat. Instead, he would go and abstain from the lowest satisfaction, which is in this case feeding the pet. So if bag A got eaten, he would just replace bag D. He would replace bag A with bag D. So when determining what the value of something is, and then deciding whether or not someone wants to engage in an exchange, what matters is how valued the satisfaction is that it meets. So if I want to give you something, the only way I'm going to trade what I have for it is whether or not that good, uh, or where that good lines up with my subjective preferences. If I value, let's say, my money more than I value an extra bottle of water, because the extra bottle of water I don't really have any use for, well, then I'm not going to engage in exchange. But if I could use that extra bottle of water as maybe a gift for someone and I value that more than I do $2 or $3, well, then I'll go ahead and I'll engage in the exchange. This also helps resolve the what's known as the diamond water paradox, which is real briefly the idea, or the question, I should say, about why diamonds are valued more than water, when water is way more useful and diamonds are basically nothing more than just shiny rocks. And the answer to this, based on this marginalist revolution, based on this subjective theory of value, is that water is way more abundant, and it's so therefore it's already meeting people's most valued and most urgent wants and satisfactions. They're already drinking it for their health, to when they're thirsty. They are already using it to bathe, to clean, and so all of their satisfactions are met to the point where an extra bottle of water, they can't really think of what other satisfaction, what else they would need with it. So it's really, it doesn't have much value to it. It's not worth it to them. Now, when that changes, when they can think of something that they would value a little bit more highly, they then go out and get that extra bottle of water. So the next thing I want to touch on is an understanding of how time preference influences people's subjective preferences and the things that they value. And the idea with this is basically there's a distinction between a high time preference and a low time preference. A high time preference is the preference to want things immediately, to want things right now, to not want to wait. So that would be in the case of the popular case of the experiment where you tell a kid, hey, you get one marshmallow now, and if you don't eat it for 5 minutes, you get two marshmallows. A kid with a high time preference is going to eat the first marshmallow, even though they would benefit more if they waited, because they have such an urgent and high time preference. While the other person, the person with the low time preference, is willing to wait. So that would be the child who'd be willing to wait the 5 minutes and end up getting two of the marshmallows. This also plays into money and loans and savings. So if someone has $100 bill, what that means is if they have a high time preference, they value that $100 more in the present than they would that same $100 bills in the future. Time preference also plays a role on money and people's willingness to give away some of their money, loan out some of their money to other people, because everyone pretty much values, if all things else are equal, pretty much values the same amount of money. Let's say $100, they would value that same amount of money in the present more so than they would that exact same amount of money in a year. And this is mainly because within that whole year, they're able to use that money if they need it. They have the satisfaction of knowing it's in their bank account, and they don't have to worry if something comes up that they aren't going to necessarily be able to pay for something if they need to. What they would, though, be in favor of, what they would value is a higher quantity of money a year from now, as opposed to that same $100. So maybe if it's the same $100, they would prefer to have it sooner rather than later. But if the question was, would you prefer $100 now or $150 in a year from now? Well, now that changes things, and based on the person's time preference, they'd be more or less willing to hold off the year and get the 150 instead. So if they have a high time preference, they'll probably say, no, I need more money. So it might be 200 or 300 or 400. Where someone who's got a low time preference would say, yeah, that's sure, or they might even be willing to go lower. You might be able to give them $110 a year from now, and depending on how low their time preference is and how worried they are about the value of the money in the future. This also, as you can kind of see, plays into people's willingness to save their own money. People with high time preferences are not super interested in saving their money. They'd rather go out and spend and consume as much as possible. Whereas someone with a low time preference is willing to abstain from consumption, is willing to forego the pleasures of all of these, of satisfying all of these immediate wants and demands, and instead would be saving that money and essentially accumulating it over time for the future. So now this brings us to the role of the employer. And basically what the employer does is the employer is someone, the capitalist is someone with a low time preference. And they've done saving in the past. They were probably a wage earner, or they've got some type of inheritance, or they took out credit. But even with credit, you'd have to show credit worthiness, which normally involves some type of prior saving. So the capitalist is someone who's really done some prior saving, or someone in that chain has done some type of prior saving. They've at some point foregone present consumption and now have acquired capital because of that saving and that holding off of consumption. And then they want to embark on a project. They see that there's a demand that needs to be met out in the marketplace. The demand for this item or this thing in the market is currently so high that people are willing to pay more than the production costs to essentially more than it costs to produce it. So what this means is the entrepreneur, if they can enter that industry, they can produce the item for production costs and then get it to the consumer for what they're willing to pay above the production costs. They're going to be able to go ahead and essentially make a profit. They can't do this on their own. They need a team. They need help to go and do this. So to make it easy, let's say it's an entrepreneur and people need t-shirts, and people are willing to pay $20 for a t-shirt, and it only costs $10 to make a t-shirt. And the capitalist needs another person to help him run his t-shirt making machines. So he goes out, he looks for people in the market, in the job market, and he says, hey, I have this plan. I see that people are willing to pay basically double what it costs to produce this t-shirt. Are you willing to help me out? We can make 1,000 t-shirts, and then by the end of the year, we'll have $20,000, and we can split it 50-50, and we'll walk away with $10,000 each. And for most people who are out in the job market, they're out there because they haven't done this prior saving. So what that means is they would love to join the t-shirt making process, but they can't wait the full year until they sell all the t-shirts and get their $10,000 from the sales of all the t-shirts that they sold, because they have a house that they need to pay, they have to eat food. So for the whole year leading up to it, they need to be able to survive, they need a paycheck, and they haven't done the necessary savings that they can tap into. So what the entrepreneur does, what the capitalist does, the employer, they make a deal. They say, hey, I will be willing to give you a cash advance of that $10,000. So instead of waiting for the full year to get the $10,000, you can get it earlier. And I'll give it to you in little payments every 2 weeks or every month. So you'll get that lump sum spread out over the different months. However, as we mentioned earlier, people, all things considered, value the same amount of money more in the present than they do in the future, but they'd be willing to part with that present money for a greater amount of future money. So while the person would not be willing to, the capitalist would not be willing to give $10,000 away for the exact same $10,000, he would be willing to give a smaller amount of money away for $10,000 in a year from now. So instead of getting the $10,000, he'd say, I'll give you $8,000 or $9,000. And depending on the worker's time preference, they'd be able to make a deal. And if not, another worker could step in, and ultimately you'd have a competition between this to come and the total, the average kind of time preference of the society would basically be what that amount basically goes to. So what that means is instead of getting $10,000 at the end of the year, the person is going to get a loan, a cash advance of, let's say, $8,000 or let's say $9,000. So they get $9,000, and then in a year, they're expected to pay the other person back $10,000. And so now we go through the full year. They produce all the goods. The employer every week is giving him a paycheck totaling $9,000 at the end of the year. And then they finish making the t-shirts. They go to the market. They sell the t-shirts for a perfect $20,000, and then they split it 50-50. The employer takes $10,000, and the capitalist takes the other $10,000, or the employee takes the other $10,000. But the employee had borrowed the $9,000 in advance from the capitalist, and now with the interest, which is the extra $1,000, has to pay back the capitalist. So while he just got that $10,000, he's got to turn around and give it right back to the capitalist. Or another way of thinking about this is the employee simply takes the cash advance in the beginning in exchange for the capitalist, for the employer, taking the value, taking the total amount of whatever sells in the end. And this is obviously a situation that is mutually beneficial, that both agree on, and that is non-exploitative whatsoever, because you have one person who values the money urgently, who's willing to work, but he needs money now, and you have someone else who's willing to give that money away, but on a particular condition, and that's that additional interest, essentially. Now, in addition to advancing the wages that the employer did, or that the employer gives the wage earner, they also are taking a huge risk and having to wait the entire time without really getting paid for any of that money. And the worker, on the other hand, is guaranteed pay. So every paycheck, he's getting a pay, he's getting pay, he's getting pay. And then at the end of the year, if nothing sells, well, he spent a whole year producing $0 worth of value. Yet for that entire year, he made $9,000. Now the employer is going to turn around and say, "Hey, give me that $9,000 back." The employer is going to take the hit and not make any money. So he had risked and sacrificed and essentially lost his own money that he saved from some other adventure, from some other thing. He risked that money and essentially lost it on a bad foresight of thinking that consumers wanted his t-shirts when they really didn't. And now he can't go and get that. While the worker gets to keep the money and hasn't experienced any of this loss. He might, after the fact, he might have to go and the worker might have to go and find a new job. But during that time, he didn't lose anything. And so I think that also should help clarify then what the role of profit is. It's not the interest that the employer gets from giving the cash advance. He's going to get that no matter what. That the profit is how well the capitalist, how well he's meeting the demands of the consumer, and that is completely absent in the exchange of money between the wage earner and the employer. Instead, where profit comes from, like I said earlier, was from the consumers. The consumers have a demand, and they basically let this demand, or the entrepreneur forecasts this demand, that they're going to be willing to pay, subjectively going to be willing to pay a higher price for something than it costs to produce it, for whatever reason, because it's more useful or whatever it is, and no one else is doing it because the supply is low. So the entrepreneur steps in, and again, let's say it's with the t-shirts, it was $20 and then it's 10. So the entrepreneur steps in, they're willing to buy the t-shirt for 20. So he steps in, he makes a t-shirt that's 10, and then he sells it for 20 and he makes $10 profit. Well, now that sends a signal out to the rest of the economy and lets all the other capitalists know, hey, this guy is meeting demands and getting a huge reward for it. Come in and see if you can do a better job. And so now other entrepreneurs come in and they say, hey, he's making an extra $10. I could do the same thing, since it only costs 10 to produce. I could do the same thing for 19 and make an extra $9 instead. And then someone else comes in and bids it down to 18 and then 17, all the way down until you basically get to the production cost. And as that falls, the prices of the t-shirt falls for the consumers, so they all benefit. You get additional workers coming into the industry to help them out as well. And then as the profits start to fall, some of those entrepreneurs, after those demands have been met, they start moving out into other industries where the profits are much higher, so they can go and meet those satisfactions. And as they do that more and the t-shirts start to fall, eventually the demand would rise again for t-shirt, and they can step back in that. So they constantly kind of moving around to meet different demands. And on top of that, the entrepreneurs who don't want to leave the industry, they can stay in the industry by investing in better productivity and increasing their production. So one of the main ways of going about doing this is really with machinery, is being able to buy machines, buy things, or figure out methods where you can produce more of the same item for less of a cost. Because essentially what this does is it brings your total cost of production down to where instead of it costs $10 to make a t-shirt, you could now bring that cost down to maybe $8 a t-shirt or $7 a t-shirt. And now you'd have that advantage over your competition, who cannot go any lower than $10 because of the costs of production, and they don't know your ingenious way of being more productive. And so now, while they can't go below 10, you can sell for 9, and you're still making a $1, $2, $3 profit. And once they figure that out, they then go down as well, bid it all the way back down, then again to that production cost, and you can once again bring it down to now $5 to produce, until ultimately it costs nothing to produce this item, and then we're living in a world essentially where that item is no longer cost prohibitive, at least to produce, and we can meet as many needs and demands for that item as possible, depending on whether or not the resources required for that item are better needed somewhere else. So that might affect the prices as well, as the scarce resources get used up, the prices for those are going to start to rise, and that's going to have an effect, and that's going to hold people off and get it to essentially not fall to the point where they're over consuming. So I hope that helps kind of clarify a couple of different things. The first being the exploitation objection to capitalism. The second being the marginalist revolution and the subjective theory of value, and how time preference kind of plays a role into that. And then on top of that, obviously being the role of the employer and the employee, and how it's not a relationship of exploitation. And then, of course, where profit comes from, and how it's not necessarily about interest, but how it's about meeting the subjective preferences of the consumers who are willing to pay more for a good than it costs to produce.